Actually, I'm ashamed to say that although this is my 8th or 9th visit to Russia, I don't speak Russian. I learned some very useful phrases like "Я не понимаю" and "Я не говорю по-русски", but that's about my limit, I'm afraid. A few words here and there. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many people. Can I just ask who you are? How many of you are students? Quite a lot. How many of you are school teachers? Quite a lot. Some are both, all right. And how many of you are university staff, university professors? Okay. And how many of you are none of those? All right, so everybody is in some way involved in English teaching. Okay. What I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is not English language teaching as such. Usually, when I come here, I speak about English language teaching. Today, I'm going to speak more about the macro context in which English language teaching takes place. We don't teach English in a vacuum. I'm going to make some points today that I suspect you won't agree with. That's absolutely fine. I hope you'll go away and think about them, though. And maybe we'll have a chance to discuss. What I'll try and do is talk maybe for about 40 minutes, and then that'll give us time for discussion. Sometimes I talk too much, but I'll try to not talk too much today. And hopefully we'll have a bit of time for discussion at the end, okay? So, that's a good start. Wrong way. Oh, right, all right. Do we know why that's disappeared? That's a good start, isn't it? Shall I not press this button? Shall I just press the button on the computer? There it is. Let's just do it on the computer. It might be easier. Okay. Right. Here we have 5 photographs. What do you think these photographs have in common? Teaching. They're teaching, yes. Schools. Primary schools specifically. And they're all English lessons. What's different about them? They're all in different, not only in different countries, they're all in different continents. So we have Italy, the United Arab Emirates and Tanzania at the top, and Colombia and South Korea at the bottom. This is an illustration, of course, of what we all know, that English today is a global language. English is all over the world. And that's what I want to talk about today, the spread of English, how it's got to where it is today, and what some of the consequences of that are. So we're going to start with a little quiz, okay? So with the person next to you, first question, if I can find it, there it is. Right, the top 5 languages with the most native speakers are Arabic, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, English and Hindi. Can you put them in order, starting with the one with the most native speakers? That's question number 1. Just keep just now, we'll go through all the questions and I'll come back to them. Let me try it again, see if it works. No, it doesn't work. No, it doesn't seem to work. Oh, there, okay. Right, question number 2. How many languages in the world are classified as endangered? 500, 1,500 or 2,500? Just keep your answers for now and we'll come back at the end. All right? Might need 2 clicks. All right, 2 clicks each time. Approximately how many languages are spoken in Papua New Guinea? 120, 320 or 820? How many people use English as a second or a foreign language? 1 billion, 1.5 billion, or 2 billion? Where can you take prenatal English classes? Saudi Arabia, South Korea, or Spain? Please take 1,000 salutations to your lotus feet. Where does this come from? Does it come from a poem written for a royal birthday, for an inquiry about PhD study, or from an essay about global English? Okay, let's have a look at the answers. Mandarin has the most native speakers in the world. The next two, it depends on the classification you look at. Some say Spanish, then English, some say English, then Spanish. It depends, they're quite close. And in fact, the same with the last two. Some classifications say Arabic, then Hindi, and some say Hindi, then Arabic. But English, of course, is not the language in the world with the most native speakers. It's either second or third. Now, UNESCO has 5 categories of endangered languages, and current estimates that nearly 2,500 languages are in one of those categories. And over the past century alone, around 400 languages have gone extinct. And if we continue at the current rate, we will lose, some say 50%, some say 90% of the world's languages. The spread of English is often seen as the cause of language loss around the world, one of the main causes. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Question 3, 820 languages are spoken in Papua New Guinea. It's the most linguistically diverse geographical area in the world, the most linguistically diverse country in the world. Of course, although you wouldn't think this when you hear some of the things that are said about English, and particularly about English native speakers, actually most of the world is bilingual or multilingual. Most of the world is not monolingual. And we'll come back to that as well. Question 4, I would say it depends on what you mean by use English. If you talk about people who use English regularly in their lives, estimates are around 1.5 billion. If you think of people who are learning English, including those primary school children we saw at the beginning, then we're probably closer to 2 billion. Apparently you can do prenatal classes in Korea. I've never been able to verify whether this is actually true or whether it's just an urban legend, but I've heard that you can. And I wouldn't be surprised. The mania, if you like, for learning English around the world has led to many interesting initiatives. Of course, there may be something in this. This is not necessarily so rare or so unexpected. I mean, if you think about the way that they say, for example, that children can hear music in the womb, why can they not hear a language in the womb? So there may be something in that. However, it does illustrate how English is being introduced at an ever earlier age. And question 6 was actually an inquiry about a PhD study. It was an email that I was sent by a student from Nepal who wanted to come and study a PhD at Aston. And that was his greeting. An excellent example of a variety of English, Nepalese English. Obviously, I assume, an extremely highly respectful greeting in Nepalese English. So of course English has many, many different varieties today, and we'll be looking at that as well. Right, let's think a little bit now about how and who is using English around the world. Just take a few minutes to look at this example. Can everybody read it okay? Can you read it? Can you see it at the back? Yeah? What do you think's going on here? Yeah?
Maybe these people are discussing the price they can afford for buying decorations or something like that.
Yeah, they are. Okay, so we've got people. Yeah. Do you think these are all native speakers of English? No. If you look in line 2, okay, so we get the first speaker says, what's your bottom line? The second speaker says, what's my? Okay, what we've got here, and then we have to have a negotiation of what's your bottom line, what does that actually mean? What we have here is an example of an English as a lingua franca situation. We've got, in this particular case, one of the speakers is actually a native speaker, the other one isn't. That's not a definition of an English as a lingua franca situation. It may be a situation where nobody is a native speaker of English. But it shows, this is an example of what is increasingly common in conversations in English around the world, where people are using English even though they don't share it as a first language. And it may, as in this case, lead to the need for negotiation of meaning to reach mutual understanding. So that's one example of how English might be used today as a lingua franca. Here are 2 more examples of how English might be used today. What do you think of, what do you think these 2 are examples of? They're examples of varieties of English, in this case used for literary purpose. Do you have any ideas what variety of English they might be? They're 2 different ones. What varieties they might be? The second one is Indian, yeah. The second one is Indian English. We see typical features of Indian English here. The use of the present progressive for stative verbs. I am standing. I am not understanding. Nearly. We also see repetition for emphasis, fighting, fighting. And we also see, for example, the lack of an object pronoun. So, but modern generation is neglecting it. Okay? And lack of articles as well. Okay? So typical features of Indian English. The first one is actually Nigerian Pidgin. Yeah, okay. Where again we see, for example, spellings that reflect pronunciation, and we also see the use of local words from indigenous languages. So these are examples of different varieties of English that are used around the world. In this case, these are for literary purposes rather than daily use, but they are good illustrations of varieties of English. Here's another example. Now this one's interesting because both these speakers, users, let's call them users, both these users are from Thailand. So they actually share a first language. Now this is text messaging. Okay? So what these 2 English users are doing is drawing on their linguistic repertoires to communicate with each other. They are mixing, they're code switching their Thai and their English. Probably they're using English because it's easier in text messaging. Quite possibly, we don't really know, could be. But they're using their language resources that they share in order to communicate with each other. And then one final example, very quickly. These are shop signs that I photographed in Italy, in Bologna in Italy. I'm sure if you go into any Russian high street as well, you will increasingly see shop names in English. Okay. English is cool. English is trendy. So you get shop names like And Other Stories. Superga, of course, is an international brand, so presumably their strapline is in English because that's what they use all over the world. And you get the other shop signs mixing the Italian and the English. So English is everywhere today, as we know, and it's everywhere for different purposes, for many, many different purposes. But let's think about how we actually got to this situation. Now, you're probably familiar with the history and how we actually got to this situation and why we're in the situation we're in. But it's worth just briefly, I think, reminding ourselves. Now, one view is that English has got where it is today because of its inherent qualities. It's just such a wonderful language. So this is, for example, Simon Jenkins writing in The Times quite a few years ago, but this was his position, that English has achieved its hegemony through its inherent qualities, because it's flexible. I've also heard the point of view put forward that English has become the global language because it's easy to learn. Maybe some of you in this room would have something to say about that. It can sometimes appear to be easy to learn. Generally, however, I think that view is disputed. It's not about the inherent qualities of the language. It's very much about something else. So let's just pause briefly and listen to David Crystal. I'm sure you're all very familiar with David Crystal. So let's just listen to what David Crystal has to say about how English came to be the global language. I'm going to risk showing a video now. We may not be able to get back to the PowerPoint, but never mind. We'll try. Oh, it's gone off the screen.
A language becomes a global language because of the power of the people who speak it. It's nothing.
We might have to do it as an audio instead of a video. Well, we'll just see if we can get the video. Just think about... Oh, just put it back onto without... I wonder if it will work if we just put it on the...
Maybe.
Yeah, just without... Yeah. OK, we'll just do it on audio. It's a shame you can't see David Crystal. So we'll just put it back. Yeah, OK. So we'll do it as an audio rather than worry about the video. Just listen to what Dave... It's a shame you can't see him, but he's sitting in his studio. Listen to what he has to say about the reasons why English has become a global language, and maybe just make a note of what he says.
There's nothing about English grammar or vocabulary or pronunciation or spelling that makes English an appealing language at a global level. In fact, if you think about it, English spelling would put most people off, you think. So it's nothing to do with the structure of language. No, it's all to do with power. But power means different things at different times. English first became international because of political power, military power, the power of the British Empire, really. But it isn't just political that takes a language around the world. There are going to be other factors too. A century later, we're talking about the 16th, 17th century there, we had the power of science, of technology, the Industrial Revolution. English is the language of science. That started then as something like 2/3 of the people who invented all the things that made modern society what it is, did so through the medium of the English language. And then in the 19th century, economic power, money talks always, and the language that was talking in the 19th century was English, because America and Britain between them had the money markets of the world sewn up for the most part. And then in the 20th century, we have cultural power, with English being the language of the vast majority of the inventions that made modern society what it is. So it's English turning up in the, as it were, almost the right place at the right time during these last 400 years or so that has produced the enormous global status that it currently has.
OK. So can we get back? I can turn that down now. OK. No. So English has, according to Crystal and according to most researchers and commentators, English has spread because of power. And I think it's worth remembering that. Power, different types of power, economic power, military power, scientific power, cultural power. And as he said, being in the right place at the right time. So there's a certain randomness of it as well. But I think it's well worth remembering this idea of power. So just bear that in mind as we carry on. So let's just go back in time a little bit and just remind ourselves of these different phases. Galloway and Rose summarise it quite nicely. They summarise it as the spread of English through 4 different channels, which clearly also influences the type of English that we're talking about. So first of all, we have through settler colonisation, and that's, for example, the spread of the movement of convicts to Australia, to pilgrims to what's now the United States. Then we have Channel 2 through slavery, which leads to English in Jamaica, in the plantations of Jamaica and other slave states, and to the development of pidgins and creoles, English-based pidgins and creoles. Then we have the trade and the colonial exploitation through trading with places like India, for example. And finally, we have globalization, the current spread that we've got, leading, for example, to the spread of English to China, to Russia, and to other countries around the world. Jenkins has made the distinction here between what she calls the first wave, so the settlement colonies, which led to what we now generally see as L1 varieties of English, what she calls L1 varieties of English. Whereas we have the second spread through slavery and through the colonies, which have led to what she calls New Englishes, or L2 varieties of English. Many different attempts have been made to categorize and develop models of English and the different types of English that have spread around the world. And probably, that wasn't what I wanted to do, that's it. The best known is this one, Barge Cattrew's organisation or model of English into 3 circles. Have any of you ever seen this one before? No? Okay. This is probably the one that's most commonly seen. Now, Cattrew divided English into 3 circles. What he called the inner circle, these are the states that he called norm providing. So places like the USA or the UK, sometimes called banner countries, B-A-N-A, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, America. Outside that, he had what he called the outer circle. These are countries where English is used as an official language. So, for example, countries like Nigeria, where it's used as the language of government, the language of politics, possibly the language of education. And that's places like India and Nigeria. So that corresponds to Jenkins' L2 varieties, if you like. These are what he called norm-developing countries. Then we have the expanding circle, which is basically everybody else, where English is traditionally learned as a foreign language. It has no official status in the country, but it's learned as a foreign language. Now, this is quite a convenient way of seeing English. It works quite nicely. It corresponds to what we quite often talk about, English as a native language, English as a second language, and English as a foreign language. But this model was developed back in the 1980s. That's quite a long time ago now. The world has changed, and English has changed enormously during that time. So I think there were some problems with that model at the time. There are even more problems with it now. First of all, English as a native language is not one variety of English. There are many, many different varieties of English. Lots of people worry about their pronunciation in English. Well, I come from a part of England where we say castle. We don't say castle. I don't say castle. I say castle. And that's what I taught my learners as well. If you come from Birmingham, the last day of the week is not Friday, It's Friday. So there are lots of different varieties of native English. Which one do we speak? Which one do we teach? Well, we teach BBC English, don't we? Except that now the BBC has many journalists who are from Ireland, from Wales, from Scotland. Radio 2 has DJs from the north of England with strong Lancashire accents. So which variety of native English do we teach? The categorisation misses out different types of English. There's no place in it for pidgins and creoles, but they derive from English. The whole model is based very much on geography and history. That's not how the world works today. There are different speakers of different varieties of English in all sorts of different countries. And even, I think, defining countries as expanding circle becomes problematic. What about somewhere like the United Arab Emirates, which we saw before, where English is the language you hear every day on the streets, and yet it's classified as an expanding circle country? In Sweden, now, young people, they watch television in English. Television is not dubbed. They watch it in English. They use English. They're exposed to English all the time. They use English frequently. Many Swedish children learning English no longer consider it to be so much a foreign language. It's something that they use regularly. So the classification becomes increasingly problematic. And we get these very grey areas between the different circles. So we've looked a bit at the history and what that's led to in terms of classification. But what about the impact then now, today? And what I'd like to do is to present some thoughts in particular on three areas. World Englishes, the idea of different varieties of English, the idea of English as a lingua franca, what that means, and what all of this means for us as English language teachers. So the whole idea of world Englishes is relatively new. What does it mean? It means that we can't just talk about one English anymore. We can't just talk about that English of the inner circle, that English of native speakers. Instead, what we have around the world are a variety of different Englishes. Hence the term world Englishes or just Englishes. Of course, there are different perspectives on this. Quirk, back in 1990, questioned whether these different varieties of English are simply a result of poor education systems in places like Nigeria and India, who were unable to teach their children proper English. That view is increasingly discredited. And increasingly, I think it's necessary to see that the different varieties of English are not corruptions of a standard English. They are varieties of English in their own right, with their own legitimacy. I can't remember who it was who said that we have to stop seeing varieties of English as daughters of standard English. Instead, they are languages, they are means of communication in their own right, with their own roles and with their own rules, indeed. So that's the first point, okay? It's important to underline the legitimacy of different varieties of English as means of communication in their own right, that people use every day in their lives. And Widdowson, I think, summed it up very nicely. I won't read the whole quote because it's quite long. But the important thing here is the first part, I think. He said, how English develops in the world is no business whatsoever of native speakers in England, the United States, or anywhere else. They have no say in the matter, no right to intervene or pass judgment. They are irrelevant. Okay? Basically what he's saying is that, that native speakers cannot say that a certain variety of English is better than another variety of English, or indeed they can no longer claim ownership It's no longer our language. It's a language that belongs to everybody, and everybody will use it in the way that they see fit. Another aspect of this, of course, is the idea of English as a lingua franca. So we talk about varieties of English, but they are shared. That's a particular variety that's shared by people, usually in a particular geographical area or of a particular heritage. English as a lingua franca is slightly different. English as a lingua franca, or English as an international language, as it's sometimes called, has, for a start, it has global ownership. It doesn't belong to any particular geographical area. Ooh. Secondly, the users of English as a lingua franca exploit the language according to their own needs. It's a means of communication. So the usage of non-standard forms, notice we don't talk about incorrect forms, we talk about non-standard forms, they're not errors. In fact, studies have shown that there is a certain systematicity to English as a lingua franca. And for example, we'll have a look at some more examples in a minute, but for example, for those of you who have struggled for so long with the third person S, you'll be glad to know that English as a lingua franca doesn't use the third person S at all. And I'm convinced that actually the third person S is destined to disappear from all varieties of English because it has no reason to exist. So ELF users of English are oriented towards content and they're oriented towards their interlocutors. They're not oriented to any idea of a particular standard or a particular type of English. The focus is on achieving communicative success. Okay? These are points again taken from Galloway and Rose. So this is the reality of English today. This is what we're preparing our learners for, if we're preparing them to use English in the world, as opposed to pass a state exam. So there are many, many implications here for English language teaching. Let's have a look at some of the features, then, of ELF, for example, English as a lingua franca. These are some, it's not a variety of English. Can I just make this, it's not, ELF shouldn't be seen as a variety of English. But there are certain aspects of the communication between people who do not share a first language and use English to communicate. There are certain features that have been identified as being common. So, for example, you get the extension of the collocational field of high-frequency words. So you get things like take an operation or make a photograph instead of have an operation or take a photograph. Okay? Very often these are transfers from the L1. You get meaning assigned to function words. So things like I back to Korea instead of I'm going back or I go back. You get a shift towards a common meaning of false friends. This is very frequent. So, for example, I'm not sure, this is common, I don't know if this works in Russian as well. So actually, in British English, which means in fact, in many other languages like French or Italian, attualmente, attuellement, it actually means currently or now. So you get this transfer as well. So you get novel use of morphemes, angriness, touristic. The invariant question tag, I've already told some of the students about this. We no longer have to worry about these pesky question tags that are always so difficult to learn. We can just use isn't it, or if you're a young person, you just say in it. And I hear that all the time now amongst my students. You know, when I'm in the lip, they always use it. I always hear them now using in it, in it. Shift in prepositional use. We no longer need to worry about prepositions so much. They're not so important. Countable, uncountable nouns also shift. And you get this increased explicitness as well. So how long time, black colour. So these are features that have been identified in English as a lingua franca, features that people are actually using to communicate with each other. So what does all this mean for us as English language teachers, as I said? Well, one of the consequences, of course, of the spread of English is that we get English taught at an ever earlier age. Primary schools now, kindergartens, even prenatal English. We get children learning English from an earlier and earlier age. This has consequences because it means that countries need an ever-increasing body of teachers who can actually teach English. And what very often happens is that countries introduce the policy, they introduce English into primary schools without actually thinking about who's going to teach it. And very often you end up in a situation where you either have primary school homeroom teachers who are not qualified to teach English and who may not be very confident or competent in their English, or you get secondary school teachers who are qualified English teachers but not qualified in the pedagogy for children. So that puts increasing pressure as well on teachers and an enormous demand for teacher education. You get countries introducing English medium instruction, again very frequent. In Turkey, for example, many schools have introduced English medium instruction. Countries that are from Kratchou's outer circle very often switch. Sometimes they use the local language, sometimes they switch to English. Policies tend to change. Again, teachers are never quite sure. Teachers are left trying to cope as best they can with the situation. There can be serious effects, research has shown, on children's literacy development if English is introduced as a medium of instruction too early. There was an interesting case in Italy not so long ago, actually a few years ago. One of the universities in Italy introduced English as the medium of instruction, and the students took the university to court, to the Constitutional Court, because they said it was a violation of their right to be educated in their own language. And they actually won. The university had to revert to teaching in Italian. So it is a controversial issue. And then, of course, we get the questions around who should teach English. Now, for so long and for so many years, there's been this misconception, this myth of the native speaker, this misconception that the person who should teach English, or indeed who should teach any language, is a native speaker. But if you think of everything that I've said so far, it becomes really difficult to define who a native speaker is. So how would you, who is a native speaker? Okay, so somebody born in India or Nigeria is a native speaker. Yeah? Somebody from an inner circle country, all right. But what about South Africa? It's not even in that circles. It's not even in Kratchou's circles. Any other ideas? All right. In today's world, it does become increasingly difficult to define who a native speaker is. Picaday, way back in 1985, claimed that a native speaker only exists as a figment of a linguist's imagination. His book is actually called The Native Speaker is Dead. With some colleagues, we did some research looking at teaching, co-teaching between so-called native speakers and non-native speakers around the world, because many governments introduce schemes where they import native speakers to teach English. So we did some research around that, but we also edited a collection of texts, and it's in the list of references at the end, and it's freely available. And what we found was that the reality around the world is extremely complex. So we found situations, for example, where private schools were hiring, in one particular case, an Austrian as a native speaker. And their justification was, well, he's blonde, he's got blue eyes, he can pass for a native speaker. In another chapter in the book, an American teacher of Chinese heritage was hired as a native speaker. She was born, brought up, educated in America. The children in China wouldn't accept her as a native speaker because she looked Chinese. Interestingly enough, they were perfectly happy to have her as a teacher once she admitted to her Chinese heritage and identity. So once she'd identified herself as Chinese, they were perfectly happy to have her as a teacher. They just didn't want her being the American teacher. Okay? There's another case, an ex-student of mine actually. She's Japanese. She was hired as the native speaker teacher in Japan, in spite of being Japanese. Obviously, she has a very high level of English. But she felt under so much pressure because she'd been hired as the native speaker teacher that she pretended to the children that she didn't speak Japanese. So these are the kinds of complexities that we're now getting with the whole idea of the native speaker. And I would like to say that this is a distinction that no longer makes any sense. What we need to talk about is qualified teachers. Teachers who, yes, know their subject matter, so they are competent in English, but they also know how to teach English. And that makes no difference where you are born or brought up. So if we can't define a native speaker, then we certainly can't define a non-native speaker either. And that's a distinction that in English language teaching we need to lose completely. It's no longer relevant. Personally, I don't think it was ever relevant, but it's certainly no longer relevant today. Of course, the reality is that very often we still get these kinds of advertisements, but that doesn't make them right. And I think Ali was correct when he said it's perhaps English language teaching is the only profession in the world where it's the majority that faces discrimination. So we really, against this background, against this macro context of English that I've been talking about, we need to redefine English language teaching, and we need to redefine English language teachers. English language teachers, there are various terms that have been used, things like multilingual teachers, transnational teachers, translingual teachers, competent users, various terminology has been experimented with, but the whole point is that a good English language teacher is somebody who is qualified to teach and competent to teach English. And if you think about it, let's add another dimension. Jenkins has proposed a reconceptualization of English. So at the top now, we no longer have standard English or native English. We have standard spoken Englishes for international use. And actually, the best people, the most competent people in international English are not native speakers at all, as we saw at the very beginning. Because native speakers don't know how to adapt their speech to make it comprehensible. Using idioms like, what's your bottom line, is not helpful in international English. So this is the revised hierarchy that Jenkins has proposed. And in terms of English language teaching, what Galloway and Rose are proposing are these 6 ideas. So increasing the exposure to world Englishes, or to English as a lingua franca, that doesn't mean we should start teaching Nigerian English or teaching English as a lingua franca, but just making learners aware of the context in which English is used today. Because if we're teaching our learners to prepare them to use English in an international context, then this is the reality. This is what they're going to be doing. Respect for multilingualism. No need for an English-only classroom. The world today is about using the linguistic repertoires that we all have, all our linguistic resources. So there's no reason why learners shouldn't use Russian in the English classroom. for certain things. Raising awareness of the whole idea of global Englishes and the international context and the macro context. Raising awareness of ELF. Emphasising respect for different cultures and different identities. And of course, finally, changing teaching, changing hiring practices for teachers in the English language teaching industry. What Jenkins said is that we should no longer be talking about English speakers, but we should be talking, what we should be aiming for is English knowing bilingualism. So where all languages, all the languages that learners speak are respected. So what about the future? Where do we go from here? What's going to happen next? Well, this is one view, that Chinese is destined to become the next global language. Possibility, maybe. Another view is that English will spread and spread so thinly that it will begin to diversify, increasingly diversify, and ultimately become mutually unintelligible. So split into a variety of much smaller languages. However, the truth, I think, is what Moran says. So what happens to a language when it goes global? We do not really know. It may look like any other language, only bigger. Or scale may do something new to it. What we do know is that when languages get very small, below a certain level, they disappear fast because there is no community to sustain them. When they get very large, they tend to spread themselves thinly and start diversifying. That's what we've seen so far. When they get enormous, and a lion's share of the use is as a lingua franca, this is uncharted territory. And as English language teachers, this is the uncharted territory that I think we are starting to enter now. Thank you. Right, of course I talked for longer than I was supposed to, but I'm very happy to take any questions or comments. Disagreements. I've stunned everybody into silence. Yeah. Do you want to use the microphone?
You were saying something about Nigerians speaking native English. I don't really get it.
No, I didn't say about Nigerians speaking native English. I said that Nigerian English is a variety of English. Yeah. So it's what Jenkins would consider what she would call one of the new varieties of English. But it is considered, you know, if we talk about Englishes and world Englishes, then Nigerian is one of those Englishes alongside British English, Indian English, American English, Singapore English.
Yeah, Nigerians they were colonized by Britain.
Yeah.
So I think they speak good English.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, or okay, so maybe I need to, I mean, I would be interested to hear, I mean, you might talk about a standard variety of English. I mean, I don't, what is so do you have different varieties of English in Nigeria? You have a sort of a standard variety and a local, because for example in Singapore, there's a standard Singaporean English, which is much closer to standard English, but there's also there's also colloquial Singapore English, which gives a much stronger identity to the people, and is also, I mean, I didn't have time to go into it today, but obviously, if you think about the medium of instruction and the official role of English in different countries, Many countries have, for example, I think Tanzania, for example, has rejected English as its official language precisely because of the political and colonial connotations that English, you know, and the power connotations that English has, and has reintroduced Swahili as the national language precisely because of those political aspects that you know, the sort of colonial associations. My understanding is that not all countries have done that. Some of them, and some have developed. For example, the example I gave of the Nigerian literature is considered to be an example of the assertion of Nigerian identity and kind of a taking possession of the language.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Like, excuse me. So you always categorize Nigeria with Indians, like English is Nigeria's first language. So I think Nigeria it's a country better than India. You don't categorize them together.
We're talking about different varieties of. I'm not putting them to. Well, you don't categorize them together in what sense? In the sense of the role that English plays in society.
There was a circle you did. There was a circle.
Oh, well, that's Katru. That's not me. They're Katru circles.
It's just I'm trying to make it clear that Nigeria is
Different.
Yeah, English it's their first language.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. No. Oh, yes. And that's. But for many Indians, it's also their first language.
Yeah,
Okay.
Nigeria is a giant of Africa. You don't categorize.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair point. All right. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate. My question is, what's your personal opinion about Russian English speakers? Is it easy for you to communicate with us?
Yes. It's extremely easy for me to communicate. I mean, the exposure I've had with Russian language, with Russian speakers of English, I mean, okay, maybe I associate with the students in this university more than anything and the teachers in this university. So maybe you're exceptionally good, I don't know. But it's always, it's very, very easy to communicate with Russian speakers. And I think what I find very interesting, not only with Russia but with other countries I've been to, is the fact that many of you have learnt English through what would be considered to be traditional methodologies, which have, in the literature, and I make it clear in the literature, are often discredited and criticised, and yet your English is superb. And that confirms to me that actually, when it comes to language learning, it's probably not the methodology, it's probably something else that's the key factor in language learning success, and I suspect it's probably motivation. And have we got time? Yes.
Okay, thank you for coming. And I have a question. So, do you know that in our region there is a special pronunciation of the sound G? So we not pronounce like G, but like G.
Okay.
And,
I didn't know that.
I have a question. Some of my students at school pronounce, just for example, the word good, not like in the right way, but good. So, is it possible just, should I pay attention to this, or I can just leave it in such way?
Don't you think, I suspect that it's entirely comprehensible what they're trying to say from the context in which they're saying it. Yeah. I wouldn't be, I think it's really important. I think it's really important. How old are your learners?
From 10 to 15.
Yeah, they're young. Yeah, they're young. You know, very often I think we complain, as teachers, we complain that students are reluctant to speak, and it's very hard to motivate them to speak. But if as soon as they open their mouth and they say hood, and we're saying, no, it's good, it's hardly surprising that they won't speak anymore. I'm a great believer in, especially, I mean, I think I think we always need to think very carefully about the pedagogical purpose of the activity we're doing. So if the activity we're doing is to promote speaking, I wouldn't be correcting anything unless I couldn't understand what they were saying, in which case I would ask for clarification, like that first example we saw. If I couldn't understand what they were saying, I would ask them to clarify it. If I'm doing a pronunciation exercise, then no, then I would insist on it being good. But I think we really need to try to encourage learners. That's something I'm going to be talking about in the masterclass a bit later, about the importance of actually learners just using the language and using the resources they can, and not trying to discourage them too much by correcting them. Because what we get then, somebody was saying, I was talking to one of the students yesterday who was saying how reluctant her adult learners are to take risks. And I think if we keep correcting learners, then they're not going to want to take risks. They'll be afraid of making mistakes. Of course, one of the problems you get into, I think, from what I was saying earlier on, about the need to prepare learners for the world outside, where accuracy is not so important, communication and meaning are more important. Then, of course, you get the contradiction that you have to prepare learners for state exams, which demand accuracy. And that's a slightly harder contradiction until we can persuade governments to change their state exams to make them more communicative and more meaning focused.
I'm a teacher of English at Intellectual School, private school.
Oh, yeah.
So my question is about some artificial languages. Once there was an attempt to create
Esperanto.
language as an Esperanto, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And when we see and hear about the diversity of Englishes, as you say, do you think there will be another attempt of creating artificial language with the help of interferences of all these Hindu, Chinese, Englishes into English? Maybe there will be one more artificial English, no? One day.
I think it's I think language is so bound up with identity, with politics, with economics, with social factors, with so many different factors. I think it's very difficult to do anything artificial with language. I mean, there have been some attempts. The picture, I don't know if you noticed the photograph that I had on the slide about the L1, the colonizer varieties of English. That was actually Merriam-Webster who created the Merriam-Webster Dictionary of American English. And he, in that dictionary, reformed the spelling. He's the one responsible for the differences in spelling, for example, the O-U-R and the O-R between British English and American English. But he succeeded with some of those reforms, but there were a whole lot more that he tried and completely failed with. I mean, attempts to artificially reform or change languages have always failed. And I suspect that any attempt to introduce, but I think they will develop naturally rather than be, sorry, rather than, stop talking. I've been told to stop talking. So I talk too much. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.